everyone. Welcome to another daily devotion here in Advent for 2025. It's a bright, sunny day. We're getting this wonderful, gorgeous weather, wonderful day as we enter into this, second week of Advent. This is for Tuesday, December 9th, if I have this right. And we continue this contemplating, what does this Advent mean? What does this season mean? Nothing perhaps may be new for us. Maybe some of it is. As always, how does our secular life not conflict, but intermingle, connect with our faith life? How are they moving together, especially as we come to the end of our secular year, right? What do we consider? I was just thinking, I wonder if I can. No, I can't. Our text today, John 18:36. My kingdom does not belong to this world. Yes, when does Jesus says this? These are words that he speaks to, at least the one that comes to mind for me. These are the words he speaks to Pontius Pilate as he is being questioned by that governor. My kingdom does not belong to this world. In the midst of all of that, he also says things like, if I were to command it, then a legion of angels would come down and save me. And he says, but I will not do that. Powerful, powerful stuff. The theme today, that text, but then also Immanuel the Iconoclast. I never use that word, iconoclast. But anyway. From C.S. Lewis, A Grief Observed. My idea of God is not a divine idea. It has to be shattered time after time. He shatters it himself. He is the great iconoclast. Could we not almost say that this shattering is one of the marks of his presence? The Incarnation is the supreme example. It leaves all previous ideas of the Messiah in ruins, and most are offended by the iconoclasm, and blessed are those who are not. Iconoclasm. I've never heard that word, but but the same thing happens in our private prayers. And most are offended by the iconoclasm, and blessed are those who are not. But the same thing happens in our private prayers. Yes, so I paused a little bit there just to double check that I was right in my definition of iconoclast. Iconoclasm, what a word, right? Going up against traditions, right? This iconoclast. Powerful against that. That's what Jesus was doing, right? God with us, going against that, questioning us. It's that thing that we talked about where we heard, or the point I was trying to get across too in my sermon this last Sunday is, the words that we hear from John, especially, I built it up and I realized we have our lessons and carols coming up. So we won't hear the second John the Baptist text. But it's the one where John is in jail and Jesus has been doing things, but John's pretty much like, are you sure? Are you sure the Messiah? Because this isn't the Messiah I was looking for. I just need to silence my phone. Sorry about that. And technology, my watch. Whoops. So John's like, are you sure? Because you're doing this. Why aren't you the warrior that I wanted? He doesn't say those words, but he's implying those words. Because he's in Johnson jail, and he sends his, in a sense, disciples to go to Jesus and kind of be like, hey, what's up? And in the midst of that, they're like, well, this is where John's coming from. And Jesus is like, let's pause. Let's talk about that a minute. Let's ponder these things, right? Because, I am not what anyone was expecting, and that's part of it. But isn't that a good part of it, what would it be like? I mean, would everything be the same if Jesus was the warrior with on the horse, with a sword drawn, coming in and cutting off heads like David and carrying him around and just this warrior? What would that say about Jesus, the Messiah? What would that say about God? But then also, on the other hand, knowing some of the Old Testament, why wouldn't Jesus be like that? So, how do we contemplate all of that? Anyway, our writer says this. When Lewis wrote these words about iconoclasm, I hope I'm saying that right, he was going through a very difficult period of his life, if that makes sense. His wife, Joy Davidman, had died recently. God wasn't acting the way Lewis thought he should under those circumstances. God didn't seem to be hearing his prayers, even though God was. Likewise, everyone in first century Judaism had an idea of what the Messiah would look like when he came. Some thought of the Messiah as a conquering king. I didn't read ahead. There you go. But only a few thought of him as a suffering servant. Pilate, too, had an idea of the kind of leader Jesus was alleged to be when he asked, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Right? That was only 3 verses before the one we heard today. That's when Jesus, the iconoclast, said, "My kingdom does not belong to this world." An iconoclast breaks the mold, ignores tradition, does things very differently. Lewis calls God the great iconoclast, because one of the molds that Jesus broke was the earthbound kingdom mold. There's lots of hyphen words in there. In the minds of his hearers, Pilate thought Jesus was a political leader. And even some of Jesus' followers thought he had come to drive out the Roman occupiers and bring political freedom to Israel. But Jesus just told Pilate, "My kingdom does not belong to this world." Too often we think like Pilate, looking for political solutions when we should be thinking of spiritual solutions. So before we get to, there's a question here, but before we get to that, this is also perhaps where we can see the error of Judas's ways, right? Judas was like, okay, Jesus is doing this, but then it's like, but he's not doing it. And he kind of gets to the point where he's like, well, this surely can't be him. He doesn't really know. We're being graceful here, not just as Lutherans, but as Christians and as people. And Judas sets everything up, and then he comes to the realization, right? I was wrong. And that's when he tries to give the silver back. Judas gets a bad rap. He made a mistake, a humongous mistake, right? But again, all of that needed to happen wouldn't have happened if Judas didn't act this way. That is why I believe, and you don't have to believe this, that is why I believe, and it is so powerful to see why Jesus still communes with him. Judas is still there at the Last Supper. Sorry, my chair fell. Judas is still there at the Last Supper. He is communed. Jesus still welcomes him. Jesus still calls him his brother. Jesus still looks those who killed him in the face and said, "I forgive you." God, Father, right? Do not bring your wrath down on them. There's a lot happening in, of course, the whole crucifixion scene leading up to it, all of that, which is why it's important. I'm going to plug this right now, especially since we got our first Lent 2026 mailing today. It is so important not to just come to church on Palm Sunday and then come on Easter. You've got to get into that valley in between. You've got to explore that and how that affects you. It is so powerful because there's more to the story than we even know. I remember, I'm going to go over my 10 minutes, sorry. I remember talking to a woman who had been a Christian. She'd been a Lutheran all of her life. how many Holy Week services or any of that did she come to? 1 week. 1 week in her whole life. And it was a week that I was her pastor. Now, did I do that? No. I don't take credit for that. But she came and I remember her saying to me on Good Friday after service, I didn't realize. And at the time, I was very new. And I'm just like, yeah. But those words, I didn't realize as she walked out from service. Powerful. They speak volumes. So, too often we think like Pilate looking for political solutions when we should be thinking of spiritual solutions. The question here, what icons, images, or molds is God breaking in your life? What expectations do you have that God does not seem to meet? Perhaps that is God's plan. It usually is. I have a little issue with those last words there because, I'm not one that is like, oh, well, God's doing this. God tests us. Why would God do that? Why? Doesn't make sense. But if that's something you believe, I don't want to step on that. But again, let's pause. Let's think about it. Why would God do that? Is again why I'm not a Calvinist. Because somehow there's this belief that God's up there playing chess with us and to do some game. We are not a game to God. We are family to God. We are siblings, right? We are children of God, all of us, whether we claim that or not. God isn't up there doing these things because it's fun. God isn't the God that we hear in Job, which again isn't factual book. What? Ooh, let's think about that. We'll see who watches this. The God of Job going, oh, okay, well, I'll do this to Job to see what happens. But what icons, images, or molds is God breaking in your life? So many. So many when we stop to think about it. What expectations do you have that God doesn't seem to meet? So many. So many. But pause. Let's think about that. Perhaps is this in the plan? Because it usually is. I don't know about that. Not that there isn't a plan, but that, again, somehow, oh, it's just this. We're just doing this. No. No. Anyway, a lot there. Let's close in prayer. God, give us patience to await your blessing and the faith to believe that it is coming. Amen. Okay, that was a long one. I'm sorry. I got a little winded. It's probably because it's the afternoon and it's coffee. That's why I switched to water. Till tomorrow. God bless.